Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going back to the channel Casual Lectures, who seem very much to be inspired by other channels, such as Salmonella, even in their art style. But they seem to be doing quite well and have some pretty interesting topics, even if they do borrow some of those topics. Listen, everybody borrows from others, right? Nobody is reinventing the wheel here. We're just all learning from one another and then applying that to our own channels. So Casual Lectures is talking about weird historical events with unexpected consequences, and the first thing I think of, obviously, with something like this is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip, leading to one of the most devastating wars of all time, and probably the most devastating century of all time, as there's a cascade of events that happened because of World War I. But there are lots of others, so I'd be very curious to hear what they are going to be. I think of the assassination of Julius Caesar because he was a tyrant that leads directly to there actually being a dictatorship, permanent one in the Roman Empire as well. And I see kind of a Roman art style there. So big thank you to Patrick in Sterling, Virginia, and William in Titusville, Florida. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Call it a trigger event, part of a larger domino effect, or an example of path dependence. One historical incident can appear to fan the flames of major or minor subsequent events. A deadly virus that sparks the creation of a famous beverage, perhaps. Or a monkey bite that causes the death of thousands. Seemingly small occurrences can have large and often unexpected consequences.
So he's showing the butterfly effect there. That's the idea that one small thing, maybe even an unnoticed event, can be a trigger for massive things. The theory comes from the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings could cause a trigger of events that leads to a hurricane, for example. And I won't go through that whole thing, but absolutely true. Many examples of that.
So today we will take a look at some minor historic events that triggered or at least supported larger historic events in the future. Not all of those events are massively important, but instead...
All right, let's just take a moment and acknowledge one of the most iconic film comedy scenes in a history scene of all time. This is from the movie The Life of Brian by Monty Python, and this is the very famous Biggest Dickus scene. It's rather irreverent, but if you've seen it, you know.
More fun or interesting. Number 1. A wrong turn led to the death of Austria's Archduke Franz Ferdinand and sparked World War I. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was a key event in the lead-up to World War I, one often considered to have started it all. In truth, tension among European powers was intense by the time Ferdinand and his wife Sophie visited Sarajevo, and their death was merely the last straw. That makes it even more weird that a minor mistake like making a wrong turn had such an impact on the future.
And he makes a great point there, and we've talked about this before, that many people have described the situation in Europe as a powder keg that was just waiting for someone to light the fuse. And if Gavrilo Princip hadn't lit the fuse in Sarajevo that day in late June of 1914, someone else would have lit it somewhere else at some other time. And I think that's probably a fairly accurate depiction of the situation. But the fact is, that is what lit the powder keg. So we can talk all day about what could have happened. That is what happened, and that did lead to that, and it was because of a wrong turn. We've done other entire videos about this, but just briefly, there was an assassination attempt with bombs. Franz Ferdinand gets away unhurt, should have left the city. That should have been the end of it, but he decides to go visit the guys in the hospital that were hurt, go back on his route. They take a wrong turn. They're backing out of this one-way street, this dead-end alley that they go down, and they happen to go right past where Gavrilo Princip is sitting outside at a cafe trying to decide whether or not he's going to take his own life. And history happens.
Franz Ferdinand was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and visited the capital of Bosnia to oversee military drills. Slavic nationalists in the region, many of whom were in the Black Hand, wanted to establish an independent state and rid Bosnia of Austro-Hungarian occupation, and they were ready to kill for that goal. The group stationed members all along the Archduke's motorcade route.
So apologies, I didn't know he was now going to run through the whole thing, so I guess I got a little ahead of myself.
Conspirators failed to eliminate Franz Ferdinand during the morning hours of June 28th. One neglected to throw a bomb, another didn't pull out his pistol, and another bomb thrown at his car missed. Later that day, a discussion to detour from the Archduke's planned route went untranslated to the driver of his car. As a result, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's vehicle took a wrong turn onto a road it never should have traversed. Since this was an unexpected detour, there were no guards on this street. However, who was on the road was Gavrilo Princip. He saw the Archduke, fired a pistol at the car, and hit both Franz Ferdinand and his wife, who both succumbed to their injuries. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia exactly 1 month later. Russia then mobilized to support Serbia, which resulted in Germany declaring war on Russia on August 1st. By the time Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia on August 6th, Germany had already declared war on France, one of Russia's allies, which prompted Britain to declare war on Germany.
Not quite. Britain didn't declare war on Germany because of France. They did it because of Belgium. Long story short, the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's plan for war, called for them to very rapidly take the French out of the war, and that meant going around their defenses in Verdun, for example, and those places. And so they had to go around by going through Belgium. They give Belgium an ultimatum: let us pass through, we don't want to fight you. But the Belgian king says no. They fight. That brings Britain into the war. Would Britain have come into the war anyway without Belgium? Probably, but too late.
The extent to which Franz Ferdinand's demise caused the conflict or triggered a larger domino effect remains a topic of discussion among historians, but it's still amazing what consequences such a small mistake can have. Number 2, a Roman's ass helped lay the foundation for the Jewish-Roman wars. Between 48 and 52 CE, Ventidius Cumanus served as the Roman procurator of Judea. The region was rife with tension and unrest. In large
Procurator of Judea would be the same title that Pontius Pilate had, if you are familiar with the crucifixion story.
Part driven by the Zealots, Jewish rebels who aggressively pushed against imperial authority in their efforts for religious liberty. According to the ancient historian Josephus, several riots broke out during Cumanus' tenure. One of the most notable came when a Roman soldier aimed his rear end at a crowd of Jewish celebrants during a Passover festival in Jerusalem. People describe the scene as follows: Roman cohorts stood over the cloisters of the temple, for they always were armed, and kept guard at the festivals to prevent any innovation which the multitude thus gathered together might make. One of the soldiers pulled back his garment, and cowering down after an indecent manner, turned his breech to the Jews, and began to taunt and insult them.
So he mooned them. I mean, that's the term we use today. Wow. I never have heard this story in my life. I'm familiar with this war because it results in the destruction of the temple and leads to just some horrible things. And it really is the trigger event for the diaspora of the Jews across the world.
Group then fell to fighting and caught up stones and threw them at the soldiers, prompting Cumanus to send in more troops. The ensuing stampede and riot resulted in as many as 10,000 Jewish deaths at the festival. The indecent exposure and subsequent violence were among many conflicts between Romans and Jews that precipitated the outbreak of the First Jewish-Roman War in 66 CE. The initial Great Revolt lasted until 73 CE, saw the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and resulted in the loss of more than 1 million lives.
Wow.
Obviously, this incident wasn't the sole or direct trigger for the Jewish-Roman War, but just the fact that a Roman soldier exposing himself played a role in causing such a massive war is just ridiculous.
That is absolutely crazy. All right, before we go any further, I did stop. I wanted to go look something up because there was something sticking in the back of my mind that didn't just feel right about something I said a few minutes ago. I talked about Pontius Pilate having the same title as Procurator of Judea. Not entirely true. Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea, and there's a difference. A prefect was more of a military governor, whereas a procurator, which came later, like in the mid-40s AD, as we used to say now, CE, was more of a civilian governor. So there was a little bit of a difference there. Same relative position, ruling the same territory, just military versus civilian.
3. Gin and tonics were born from malaria. Nowadays, gin and tonics is a well-established drink around the world, but most people don't realize that this classic was created thanks to a disease. Malaria in colonial India was a major problem for British citizens and soldiers, and as a result, they relied on quinine to combat the disease. Derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, quinine was popular with European settlers in South America.
Something bothers me here, and I don't know if he's doing it on purpose, but twice now in the last minute, he has pronounced a word differently the second time he said it. He said gin, then he said gin, then he said quinine, and then he said quinine. I don't know what's going on there.
America during the 17th century as an anti-fever drug. In colonial India, it was again used for fevers, and due to its bitterness, was usually mixed with soda water and sugar. The bubbly beverage soon became a new drink, tonic water. The first patents for it appeared as early as 1858. Schweppes tonic water entered the market in 1870 as Indian quinine tonic and was mixed with alcohol, namely gin. The addition of gin to quinine and tonic water had been taking place for decades by the time commercial concoctions came on the scene. In British India, a daily gin and tonic was essential to maintaining imperial control. Part medicinal and part social.
So I've never had gin in my entire life. I've tasted most kinds of alcohol at least once. I've never had gin. Gin, what's it like? Is it good? Does it have a flavor? What's the purpose? Let me know.
Imbibing these cocktails became part of life for British expatriates. When they returned to England or ventured to other parts of the world, gin and tonic drinkers took their affinity for the beverage with them. So the next time you have a glass of gin and tonic, you better make a toast to malaria. Number 4. Without prohibition, there'd likely be no NASCAR. We continue to talk about the history of alcohol, but we travel to the United States. The passage of the Volstead Act in October 1919 ushered in prohibition in the U.S.
And that might beg the question, the Volstead Act, well, I thought there was an amendment that led to prohibition. Well, yes and no. Constitutional amendments in and of themselves aren't necessarily law. They're the basis for law. I mean, sometimes they are. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery except in situations where a person has been convicted in a court of law, and it's a punishment. But the amendment that allowed for prohibition actually needed, most of these amendments, they need some kind of legislation to actually kind of spell out the law so that people know how to follow this, right? So the Volstead Act was the law that was permitted because of the constitutional amendment. It was the enforcement of that constitutional amendment, I guess is a way to look at it.
Once liquor was illegal, subversive beverages like moonshine, hooch, and white lightning were in high demand. Brewed in distilleries, moonshine and the like was transported from place to place by bootleggers. To avoid law enforcement, bootleggers used back roads and drove at high speeds in cars equipped to subtly carry illicit liquor. Especially common in the American South and Appalachia, bootleggers tweaked their cars to make them faster while simultaneously using heavy-duty suspension to protect their wares.
And this is why NASCAR was born in the South, and for a long time was really kind of a southern sport.
The insides of the cars were altered to carry more booze along roads with twists, turns, and other hazards. The type of driving necessary to successfully transport illegal alcohol became a skill, one that people put on display at public stock car races. After Prohibition ended in 1933, the demand for moonshine decreased, but the bootleggers found ways to keep driving, albeit on racetracks.
And it's important to note that moonshine did exist before Prohibition, and it exists now after Prohibition. I've made some myself. It's actually kind of a fun thing to do, and I have a long history of that in my family. My family comes from Eastern Kentucky. My great-great-grandfather was well known to be a bootlegger. So much so, amazing story that I will tell till the day I die. My very first time going down to Eastern Kentucky to do research on my family, I was in college. I was about 19, 20 years old. I drive down there and I'm looking for the cemetery where my great-great-grandparents are buried. My great-great-grandfather's name was Peter William Gearhart, and he died in 1911. Okay, so this is the 1990s. This is like 80 years after his death, right? And I stop in this little store that I know is in the same little kind of crossroads town where the cemetery is. And I asked the guy where Limestone Cemetery was. And he said, Limestone Cemetery? Yeah, I can tell you where that is. Who are you looking for? And I said, Peter Gearhart was my great-great-grandfather. Oh, Pete Gayhart. Yeah, big-time bootlegger in these parts. I'm like, yeah, I've heard that. And they pronounce the name Gayhart down there, which is why folks like my cousin Rebecca Gayhart, who's an actress, they actually have the name Gayhart. They started spelling it that way.
Authors from the time said that a large percentage of the early stock car mechanics, car owners, promoters, and track owners had deep ties to the illegal alcohol business. The popularity of stock car racing grew with men like Raymond Parks at the forefront of establishing racing teams. Franz and his colleagues created the official rules for NASCAR, and in February 1948, the first race took place at Daytona Beach. So while most people weren't fans of the Prohibition, every NASCAR fan should be thankful.
Was that Mark Martin's car that I saw?
Daytona Beach.
In that
so
scene?
while most people weren't...
Sure looks like it. Mark Martin was my driver when I first started getting in NASCAR. He was the driver I rooted for. Probably the greatest NASCAR driver to never win a championship.
Fans of the Prohibition, every NASCAR fan should be thankful for this part of American history. Number 5. A monkey bite altered the trajectory of the Greco-Turkish War.
Didn't know this one.
Sometimes even animals can influence human history, and this example will demonstrate how even a small monkey can lead to mass destruction. Alexander I of Greece only ruled for 3 years, but between 1917 and 1920. With Alexander as king, Eleftherios Venizelos essentially ran the country. By 1918, Greece had expanded its borders, and when the Allies met at the Paris Peace Conference, Venizelos was there.
So he makes a great point about how sometimes there's a difference between who is the ruler by law and who is the de facto ruler, right? At the end of World War I, legally speaking, Kaiser Wilhelm II was the ruler of the German Empire, but he was not the one running the country. That was basically a military dictatorship under Ludendorff and Hindenburg. But that happens sometimes.
Negotiated the treaties of Neuilly and Sèvres with Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, respectively, securing new lands in Thrace and Smyrna, as well as islands in the Aegean. Venizelos wanted to keep chipping away at the Ottoman Empire as it was...
I know I stopped in the middle of a thought there, but this is another important observation about the end stages of World War I and the aftermath of it. Like in a lot of wars, though I would say World War II is probably a difference. I feel like largely in World War II, the countries that joined the Allies weren't necessarily looking for what they were going to gain out of it afterwards. I'm sure there was some of that, but not to the degree there was in World War I. There was a lot of that in World War I. Opportunism, countries jumping in on one side or the other because of what they thought they would gain. Italy, who had been allied with the Central Powers, jumps in on the side of the Allies because they're looking for some territory from Austria-Hungary. Japan jumps in, really doesn't do a whole lot, but they want a seat at the table in the aftermath to divide up some of the, and kind of gather up some of those Pacific territories that are owned by those European powers. And Greece is now looking for that too. The Ottoman Empire was kind of seen as very weak at this point. There have been these wars in the Balkans where they lost some territory, and Greece is seeing an opportunity to get some territory.
Being partitioned after World War I, and as a result, Greece and the new Turkish state went to war. By mid-1920, Greek forces were moving deep into Anatolia. In October 1920, Alexander was bitten by a groundskeeper's pet Barbary macaque while in his garden in Athens. The king intervened when the monkey attacked his dog. While his wounds initially seemed non-life-threatening, infection set in, followed by sepsis. Alexander passed October 25th, changing the dynamic in the region.
Wait, dude died from a monkey bite? I did not know that. See? We're all still learning, man. I had no idea that a king died from a monkey bite in the 20th century.
Entirely. He had no heirs, and national elections removed Venizelos from office that November. In 1921, war with Turkey escalated and a coup removed Constantine I.
And this is another great observation here, that a lot of people think that World War I ended November 11, 1918, but there were aftermath wars that went on for years afterwards. Turkey and Greece. The stuff that's going on in Russia, where you had Western powers actually sending troops in. There were American troops in Russia during all of that. There's fighting that's, the Turkish situation doesn't resolve itself for several years because there's power vacuums and there's competition for who's going to rule. There was a time where it seemed possible that Germany could have ended up communist in the aftermath of World War I. France could have. A lot of this stuff was really confusing into the 1920s.
The following year, the destruction of Smyrna by Turkish forces resulted in the deaths of thousands of Greeks. The resulting border changes of Greece's defeat displaced millions of ethnic Turks and Greeks alike. Regarding Alexander's demise, Winston Churchill later said, "It is perhaps no exaggeration to remark that 250,000 persons died of this monkey bite."
Wow.
Number 6. M&M might not exist if it wasn't for the Spanish Civil War.
I have heard that.
After a fallout with his father, Frank Mars, the founder of US-based Mars Company during the 1930s, Forrest Mars reportedly told my dad to stick the business up his ass and move to England. While overseas, Mars developed his own candies based on some British sweet treats.
And if you want to see a really fascinating history of some of these candy companies, the History Channel has done some really phenomenal work with their docudramas on things like the men who built America and the food that built America. I know it's very American-centric, but really fascinating stuff.
While visiting Spain in 1937, he was said to have seen off-duty British soldiers eating a particular candy he described as lentil-shaped candy-coated chocolates. They were likely Smarties, although they were called chocolate nibs or chocolate beans at the time. Because of their hard shell, the chocolate didn't melt in even the hottest climates.
Interesting that they were called Smarties, because we have a candy called Smarties, but it's not chocolate.
Mars took the idea back to the US, although he called his product M&M. By creating chocolate candy that didn't melt, he developed the ideal product to include in rations given to troops, one that was much less messy than the chocolate bars that were also part of field rations. And that brings us to the end of this little tale. You can find countless of these interesting domino effects in history, and the examples I talked about were merely a few of them.
So let me know in the comment section below. Give me your examples of events that seemed insignificant, but that led to something significant or world-changing or heavily influential in some way. Kind of a butterfly effect type thing. Use the comment section below. Let me know yours. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.